My name is Chris Daw. I'm a QC at Millennium Chambers in London and also at Lincoln House in Manchester. And I'm making this video to explain my views about our broken criminal justice system. It's a massive event. The Big Law Summit is the opportunity for thousands of lawyers from across the country and even around the world to come together to think about some of the really big issues in our justice system and in our legal system and the litigation process generally. And I'm here because I've written a book called Justice on Trial, and I put justice on trial. Never has it been more important in our society to consider the bigger picture as to what's wrong with our system and what needs to change. Never has it been more important for those of us who care about the system to engage with what the system is getting so catastrophically wrong and which is damaging our society so badly. Just today, I have read of a Crown Court judge who has been put under pressure from the powers that be, somewhere in the mysterious echelons of the judiciary, not to allow people to leave prison even when he believes that they are unlawfully detained. We have a judge who has come to the view, as a matter of law, that the custody time limit should not be extended just because of the age-old excuse that we don't have the resources, we don't have the money, we can't deal with all of the cases in sufficient with sufficient efficiency and in the right time frame. And he decided the law required him to release those people from prison. And what happened? The powers that be, including other members of the judiciary, got behind the establishment, the government, to try to keep people locked up out of political expediency. That's the allegation that has been made by a sitting Crown Court judge who has made formal complaints against those who have sought to interfere with the independence of his judgments. That's the world we're living in. We're living in an age when judges of the Crown Court, judges who are independent, who are appointed without political favour and free of political influence, can be told what they can and can't do when they make decisions in their own courtrooms. It's wrong. It's unlawful. It's disgusting. It's a disgrace. But my book is about much more than that. It's about much more than the fact that we have come to such a catastrophic and broken system of criminal justice. It's about the fact that the whole system itself, the ethos, the philosophy that lies behind everything we do in criminal justice is wrong. It's broken. It's insanely counterproductive. What's the point of a criminal justice system? And I ask that question in the book, and I go all the way back in time to the very origins of criminal justice in the Mayan civilizations, in Roman times, in ancient Greece, and all the way through the Middle Ages, all the way through to Victorian Britain, into the 20th century, and into the present day. Across the world, in Britain, in the United States, throughout Europe, I look at what's the point of it? What's the point of criminal justice? It's a good question. The point of criminal justice is obvious, isn't it, when you think about it? The point of criminal justice ultimately is to reduce the amount of crime in our society, to reduce the harm from crime in our society, to reduce the number of victims in our society, to make our society a happier, a better, a safer place. But what does the system really do? When I came to write this book, I never even planned to write a book. The reason I wrote the book was because after 26 years of criminal practice, of spending my entire day-to-day existence defending in criminal cases, sometimes in the very high-profile cases up and down the land, the Hillsborough disaster, some of the major cases involving high-profile figures. I defended the then England captain John Terry when he was accused of a racist crime some years ago. And many of these cases are front-page cases. Many of the cases I've been involved in, and I did my job. I go to court. I apply the law. I apply my professional judgment to cases. I give advice to clients, and I act on their behalf in the courts. But the question I have repeatedly asked myself since I took Silk 7.5 years ago now, the question I ask myself is, what's going on? What am I actually achieving when I go to work every day? Is anything changing? Does any of it matter? And ultimately, when I asked myself that question, I came to a really quite difficult answer, which was that the great majority of what I do every day actually changes nothing. And much of what I do, and much of what we all do when we go to work in the criminal justice system every day, actually makes things worse. Because the whole system is a mythical system based on a false premise. The point of the system is to get people convicted of crimes when they've committed them, to get them locked up in prison for as long as possible. And then somehow or other, justice will be done, whatever it means, and somehow or other that will be a good or a beneficial outcome for our society. The truth is, it's not. It absolutely is not. So what's the main messages? What are the main messages in the book? The main messages are really straightforward. I start the book by talking, as I say, about the whole history of crime and punishment, going all the way back to an eye for an eye, the Old Testament philosophy that we need to punish, that we need to be cruel, we need to impose torture, we need to impose the death penalty, we need to keep people locked up indefinitely in the most horrific conditions. That was the mindset behind prison. Much of it was about private retribution. It was about how individuals who had been wronged could use the power of the society, of the state, or of government to further their own personal objectives. If someone's stolen from you, you can have them locked up until they pay the money back, and you can keep them in horrific conditions. If someone's actually harmed a member of your family or even killed someone in your family, you can kill them, or you can kill someone in their family to get revenge. All of that mindset has been behind criminal justice for many thousands of years, and probably since human civilization began. And I give a whole background to that in just a few pages. It's not even a long part of the book. In a few pages, I tell you the entire story of how criminal justice was created in the first place and how we got to where we are. But what I'm really trying to do in the book is not just moan about the state of play, not just tell people it's all wrong and it's terrible and we need to, wring our hands and wonder and worry about what to do. And I don't actually come at it from the perspective of how do we make, life easier or softer for criminals. I have absolutely no agenda that is simply around let's just make life easier or softer for criminals, because I want there to be fewer criminals. I want to put myself out of work. I want to be unemployed. And the more unemployed I am, the better our society will be, because that will mean that there are fewer people being charged with crimes, there are fewer crimes being committed, and there is a much smaller need to have a criminal justice system at all. Because criminal justice is a bit like being a cancer doctor. If my job is similar to being an oncologist. In other words, we have to have oncologists because cancer exists and because people who have cancer have to be treated. But we rather wish that they didn't. We rather wish there was no cancer. We rather wish that we didn't need oncologists at all. And we need to think about criminal justice, criminal lawyers like me, in exactly the same way. We need to exist so long as there is crime, so long as people are accused of crime, so long as people are potentially in danger of being locked up by the state. But we rather wish we didn't need us at all. That we didn't need criminal lawyers, we didn't need a criminal justice system, because that would be the perfect society. Now, we're never going to get there, of course. I'm not completely naive and unrealistic to think that we're ever going to get to a system where there's no crime at all, where nobody ever transgresses in a way that is a crime against the state or against the public more generally. But we can absolutely and massively reduce the amount of crime in our society by just a few relatively straightforward reforms. And I set them out in the book. And actually the chapter headings in the book are well worth a read, because really the chapter headings are an agenda. They're a manifesto of reform in the most straightforward and simple of terms. So, as I said, the first chapter, really straightforward. It's called A Short History of Crime and Punishment, and that's what it is. It's just 15 pages, not even 20 pages, 15 pages from the entire history of crime and punishment since time began. 15 pages, not bad, potted history. The second chapter is a really important one, and it's one that underlies the whole message that I'm trying to give to you at the Big Law Summit, and the whole message that I'm trying to give throughout the book and in all of the other media activity I've done in recent times, which included a major television series for BBC One earlier in this year called Crime, Are We Tough Enough?, which is on BBC iPlayer. You can watch it. It was on BBC One, I think, in January or February. You can watch that now. It's still available on iPlayer. So have a look at Crime, Are We Tough Enough? And you'll see me putting forward exactly the same opinions that I'm giving to you now. And, you know, the gloves are off in the series as they are for this video. But chapter 2 of my book is called this: Why We Should Close All Prisons. And that takes a moment to sink in. So let me remind you the name of chapter 2, the title: Why We Should Close All Prisons. He's mad. I'm mad. But how can we do that? We've got all these terrible people who we need to lock up and we need to keep away from society, of course. So how, you know, this is just bonkers. Is it? As I say in the book, 69% of those who are currently held in our prisons have committed no act of violence. They're non-violent criminals. They have breached an order, they have failed to pay a fine, they've committed some other act, often drug offences, including minor drug offences such as the supply of cannabis or even the possession of drugs, and they're in prison for it. Why? Why are they there? Because I'll tell you what happens when they're there, and I tell you in much more detail in the book what happens while they're there. What happens while they're there is that they learn an awful lot about one thing, one specialist subject. Anyone who's ever been in prison could go on Mastermind and talk about this subject with considerable expertise and probably get many correct answers. And the subject is this: crime. They learn about crime. Prisons are universities of crime. They have no other purpose. We flood them with people, so they are hugely overcrowded. We massively under-resource them so that they are understaffed. They do not have within their walls the personnel who can engage with those inmates who need engagement either on the mental health side, on the employment side, which is absolutely vital, on the welfare side, and even just their family connections are often broken, lost, disappear forever. And if you just think about it for a moment, and I talk about this in the book, and I use this as an example. Imagine if you were in a coma for 5 years, or 6 years, or 8 years, or 10, or 15 years. Just imagine that. You're in a coma, and you woke up on the streets just outside a prison. And in the 5 or 10 or 20 years, or however long you were locked up for, you have lost all connection with society. You don't know how anything works. You don't know anything about the technology. But worst of all, you've got nowhere to live, because wherever you were living when you were locked up, that's long gone. You have no connection with a family or anyone really, any close friends. They've all long gone. Stopped visiting you months or years or even decades ago. You have no work. You have no actual current work skills. And even if you did, if you apply for a job, when you immediately tell them I've been in prison, they won't give you a job at all. So you wake up on the street. You may be physically reasonably healthy when you come out, but you have no stake in society whatsoever. You have nowhere to go. You have nothing to do. You have a few quid that will maybe get you through the weekend. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What's your first move? Probably you'll try and find whoever you were in prison with, who's just recently been released. It's the only person you know, right? The only people you know are people you've been in prison with, because everyone else is gone. You've got nowhere to go. And the chances are that someone who's been in prison, who came out of prison, potentially in exactly the same boat as you, is already back involved in some sort of criminal activity. They may be dealing, they may be stealing, they may be defrauding, they may be money laundering. They may be doing all sorts of things. They may even potentially be a prolific sex offender. And so may you be. So what you're likely to do when you wake up from your coma is you're likely, in fact, within hours, days, weeks, or at the most months, you're likely to fall back in with the very sorts of people who are going to encourage and support you in a life of crime. That's what our prisons do. Our prisons put people in a coma. They're not asleep, but they may as well be. They put people in a coma for years or months or even decades, and they wake them up on the street with no money and nowhere to go. And shock horror, what do they do? What do they do next? What's the plan? The plan is, well, there isn't a plan, but there's an inevitability. And the inevitability is they will go out and commit more crime. And our entire prison system, which takes people, and I talk about a young man who was a very young man when he first became involved in the criminal justice system, called Gethin Jones in the book. And Gethin Jones was in care. He had no family structure as a child or a teenager, and he gradually drifted into contact with the criminal justice system and was arrested and locked up in young offenders institutions from his early teens. And unsurprisingly, he, at the age of about 20, ends up in court. I think it was for burglary or something of that kind. And he was an intelligent and articulate young man, but his background had given him no chance, and neither had the care system or any other part of the state. And what happened was, he comes for sentence in the Crown Court. He comes for sentence before a judge who tells him, "You're nothing. You'll never be anything, Gethin Jones. You're just a criminal. And I'm going to lock you up for a few years and throw away the key." And Gethin Jones shouted to the judge, "What you see here is what you made me. You, the judge, the establishment, the criminal justice system." And Gethin Jones was right. We did it to him. We as a society created Gethin Jones. We failed him, as we do so many in the care system. We failed him in the criminal justice system because we didn't recognize the truth, which is that he was a child when he was first engaged in that system, and he needed to be educated and he needed to be cared for, as all children should be, as indeed the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child requires by law, that we treat children as children, that we give them the basic rights of children to grow, to be educated, to play, to learn, to develop freely. We don't do that in this country. We lock them up in young offenders institutions that are no better than hellholes, where they are at daily risk of violence and even death, as I describe in the book in some detail. Horrific cases of young men locked up in young offenders institutions for trivial offences and then battered to death by racist psychopaths, with the establishment and the prison officers effectively turning a blind eye. That's what we're doing to children in our society, and it's wrong. So I talk in the book about why we should close all the prisons, and where in the world actually do they have a criminal justice system that works, or at least works far better than our failed system. And I draw very clear comparisons between, I travelled extensively for the book, and I travelled, for example, first of all, to Alabama in the deep south of the United States. And I spent time in prisons there and with law enforcement officers and officials and defence lawyers, and even those who had been involved in the justice system as defendants. And I talk about that in the book. And what did I find there? I found a dystopian nightmare. I found a city of incarceration, as I call it in the book, of almost 2.5 million people who are incarcerated, locked up, imprisoned in jails and prisons around the United States every single day. 2.3, 2.4 million people. It would be, as I say in the book, the 5th largest city in the United States if it were a city. And it may as well be, because the inhabitants of all of those jails and prisons up and down the United States share one thing in common, that their basic rights have essentially been overridden by a complete injustice and a nightmare of a system in which there is really no right to a fair trial. The idea of trials has largely gone out of the window. But the prisons I visited, and I describe one of them in some detail from southern Alabama, right on the Gulf Coast in Mobile, are really quite extraordinary and soul-destroying in their depravity and in the way in which, effectively, they take some of the most vulnerable people in our society or in American society, they lock them away, they often lock them away for many, many years, even for the most trivial of crimes. And if they ever do come out, and there are tens of thousands of prisoners in America who will never come out. But if they do come out, they come out in exactly the state. Even worse than they've been in a coma. They're not just been in a coma, they've been in a coma and being beaten by society. Week after week, month after month, year after year in American prisons. It's a horrific nightmare. And of course, does it stop crime? Does it reduce the level of homicide on the streets? Does it reduce the amount of financial and other forms of catastrophic damage to members of the public? Of course not. We all know that Chicago has one of the highest murder rates in the world, and many other American cities are rife with violence. Nobody stops and fails to commit a crime because they're going to get a longer and longer prison sentence in a most harsh and inhospitable custodial environment because the culture has built up around crime and violence, and it's become normalized. And it's become normalized in large measure because of the overuse of prison. And we're going the same way in Britain. So make no mistake about it. If we carry on the way we are, we will end up not with the 80,000, which is an astronomical number of prisoners in historical terms. And we are heading upwards and ever onwards towards what Boris Johnson may consider to be the magic 100,000. If we end up like America, we'll have 400 or 500,000 British people locked away in prison all the time. 4 or 5 or 6 times the number we have now. And we have the highest rate of imprisonment in Western Europe. And we're heading upwards and upwards and ever upwards. And I describe in the book why the inevitable consequence of more and more imprisonment is only one thing. It is more and more crime. More and more victims of crime, more and more economic damage from crime, and more broken lives. More and more people robbed, burgled, and more people like some of the people I met when I was filming for the BBC earlier this year, or in filming last year, out and about speaking to families. And more people who lost members of their family to serious violence and murder. There's nothing in my experience of professional practice over these years that compares to the experience of speaking to some of those I spoke to on that journey of filming the television series. Perhaps the most striking was the mother of Yusuf Maki in Manchester. Yusuf Maki was stabbed to death at the age of 17 on the streets. A young man, bright, at a very good school, with everything to live for, all the prospects in the world, and yet ended up being knifed to death in a suburban street. Why? Because we just don't get it. When it comes to young people, when it comes to crime and punishment, we don't understand how to change lives. And I talk in the book about the sorts of systems of particularly youth justice that do work, but also of prisons that work in places like Norway, where they have a tiny level of recidivism, where the reoffending rate is a tiny fraction of ours. So they only imprison in Norway those who commit the most serious violent acts. So very serious crime to get to prison in the first place. So a much smaller percentage of the population ever gets locked up at all. But those that do are infinitely less likely ever to reoffend, not because they're harsh, because they beat the prisoners every day and don't give them enough to eat or keep them in darkness or solitary confinement or some of the other madness that's advocated by the tough on crime lobby, the insanity of the tough on crime lobby. They don't do that. They keep prisoners in the most normal conditions possible, consistent with the level of security required. If somebody is a violent threat to others, they are kept in secure conditions. They're not allowed to walk the streets. But they live within the prison walls and the prison environment, which is as normal as possible, in housing units, which have kitchens, which have bedrooms, which don't have bars or barbed wire or any of the things that are used as forms of psychological control and, yes, torture in the systems of justice of the United Kingdom and in particular of the United States. And what happens when those people come out? They come out to jobs. They come out with skills. They come out with their family connections still intact. Even in some cases, their families can come and stay with them. They can cook meals for them. They don't just have to sit in a dreary prison visits room wearing a prison uniform, obviously something completely different from the rest of society. They come out of prison as human beings, and we are all human beings, whatever we've done. And that's where our system fails. So the big messages from the book, I'll tell you what the next chapter is, and it's a chapter heading which will also surprise many people. Why we should legalize all drugs. That doesn't mean we should give drugs on the street or allow anyone to sell crack to children, obviously. But it means that we shouldn't allow violent criminals to supply dangerous substances of which nobody knows the purity to anybody they like. We should have licensed premises supplying drugs that people either want to take for recreational purposes, such as ecstasy or MDMA, or have to take because of addiction, such as heroin, cocaine, and or crack. We should be able to obtain those from licensed premises without resort to drug dealers who kill, maim, exploit children, and will essentially supply to anyone they can for as much profit as they can. It's a system which is utterly broken. Since 1971, when the Misuse of Drugs Act came into force as a result of pressure from the Americans under Richard Nixon, we saw within a decade an escalation of heroin addiction that is beyond belief, from fewer than 2,000 people who had a serious long-term heroin addiction in 1970-71. By the early 1980s, just a decade or so later, that was over 300,000. 300,000 people placed in the position of being addicted to a drug that will often kill them because of overdose, because they take it from a supplier who has no ability to control purity, or which will cause them to land up in jail because they either supply it or they have to rob, burgle, cheat to get the money, the 100 or the 200 or the 300 pounds a day to pay the dealer for their daily supply. Insane. And I talk in the book about my visits to places like Switzerland, where drug users are treated as human beings again, as people in need of medical and social support and help and compassion, not cruelty, not being treated as if they are different, they are subhuman, and they need to be locked away and treated and disregarded in the way that we do in our society and as they do in the United States. Let's look to places that are civilized and mature and sensible. The emotions sometimes run away with me, and those of you who read the book will sense that in the nature of the words that I use and the extremity of some of the views that I have. But I have those views because I have spent 26 years doing a job that shouldn't exist, in a system that's broken and which undermines the very purpose for which it purports to exist, which is this. Criminal justice systems are supposed to reduce crime. They're supposed to reduce the number of mothers and fathers who get a knock on the door at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 1 in the morning to say, I'm terribly sorry to tell you that your son's in hospital and he's passed away. He's been stabbed. He's been shot. We're making that happen. We're creating those victims of crime. And this book, which tells you that the people who commit crimes are just humans, just like us. There's no such thing as good and evil people. Good people do bad things. Bad people can do good things. And I describe many such examples in Justice on Trial. But we need reform. We need to change our system. Stop treating criminal justice as a weapon of punishment and use it for its primary purpose and reduce crime. Good luck with the Big Law Summit, and thanks for watching.